December 19th, 1907. Smithton, Pennsylvania. At 11:30 in the morning, a thunderous roar erupts beneath the frozen hills of the Youghiogheny River. The ground heaves. A black column of smoke and flame bursts from the Darr Mine entrance, carrying shattered timbers and fragments of lives. Across the valley, windows rattle. Mothers drop what they're doing and run toward the pit mouth. Inside, hundreds of men are trapped, fathers, sons, neighbours, swallowed by darkness and fire. The air smells of coal dust and death. So how could something like this happen? Before the blast, Smithton was quiet. A working town stitched to the rhythm of the Darr Mine. Each morning a thin line of men crossed the bridge over the Youghiogheny, their lunch pails swinging, boots crunching over frost. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and cold iron. These were Slovak and Hungarian immigrants, men who had come seeking steadier lives than the fields of Europe could offer. Underground, they found a different kind of harvest. Black dust, sweat, and danger traded for $2 a day. The Darr Mine was modern for its time, or so the company said. A vast network of tunnels bored into the hillside, its walls supported by timber and faith. Men worked by the dim flicker of open flame lamps, their breath mingling with the invisible gas that sometimes hissed from the coal. On Sundays, the miners prayed at St. Nicholas Church, their hymns echoing over the valley like hope itself. But deep beneath their feet, something was building. An accumulation no one could see, no one could smell, waiting for a single spark. Soon, one ordinary December morning, that spark would come. The warning signs. Winter tightened its grip on the Youghiogheny Valley, and with it came a hunger for coal that seemed bottomless. Rail lines needed fuel, mills needed pea, and houses along the riverside burned through their bins by the wagon load. At the Darr Mine, production was not simply a target, it was a constant pressure that lived in the foreman's pocket watch and the ledgers on the clerk's desk. Every ton counted, every hour mattered. Men who'd come from villages in Upper Hungary and the hills of Slovakia learned quickly how the arithmetic worked. More cars loaded, more script earned, more food on the table. Safety lived somewhere down the list in the margin, acknowledged but often deferred. The signs were there if you knew how to read them. A lamp flame licked higher at the face of a new heading. The air's freshness, what the old hands called the taste, went stale in certain corners by noon. In the timbered entries where the roof sweated and the coal gleamed wet as sealskin, men sensed gas. They knew it by feel, the way it made a breath feel heavy and the back of the throat grow warm, as if the mine itself were exhaling on them. Fire damp, they said, as if naming it gave them a handle to hold. But a name is not a fence, and methane has no fear of men. There had been small flashes before, palm-sized pops when a pick struck a seam that leaked gas like a cracked jug, a thin blue flare that lifted off a wick lamp and kissed a man's knuckles, singeing hair and pride. These were warnings dressed as stories. The night a brattice cloth fluttered like a sail, though no one felt a draught. The morning a mule balked at a crosscut and would not be coaxed forward. The week a track gang replacing a broken fish plate swore they smelled something sharp, like bad eggs, though the mine boss laughed and said, "All I smell is men who need to work." Ventilation was the mine's heartbeat. When it thudded strong, men felt it as a steady breath on the cheek, the cloth on their caps rippling in the breeze. When it faltered, when a door stuck open, when a regulator slipped, when a canvas brattice sagged after a night of dripping, eddies formed in the black. In those eddies, dust hung and gas pooled. The Darr had long airways, several splits feeding busy headings. A furnace or big fan at the surface drew air in and pushed it through stoppings and doors. But a system is only as honest as the people who keep it. A door left ajar to save a few steps with a loaded car becomes a decision written in the air. Every dawn the fire boss walked the mine with a safety lamp, testing the top of the entries where fire damp haunts the roof, watching the flame lengthen, tipping the lamp toward cavities, sniffing for danger. He chalked doors, left marks on timbers, scratched notes about gas present, and used caution. The men respected him, but they also knew the clock was his enemy too. A thorough inspection takes time, and time is a tax not everyone wants to pay. More than once a heading would be declared fit, then by midday the air would feel off, the flame of an open light would draw tall, telling truths a report could not hold. Open lights were the old habit that would not die. The company issued words about safety lamps and restrictions on flame, but production favoured simplicity. Carbide lamps burned bright, oil wicks were cheap, and both left their wearers convinced they could read the air. "You can tell with your skin," men said. "The flame tells you," others swore. It told them until the day it lied, or rather, until the day the air changed faster than they did. In the year of 1907, the nation learned again and again how quick a mind could turn. In towns not so far from Smithton, men had gone to work and not returned, leaving rows of black coats hanging like shadows. News travels on train cars and in church pews. The women at St. Nicholas knew the names from elsewhere, the litany of widows, the days of confused smoke and slow funerals. And yet the mouth of the Darr kept swallowing men each morning because coal is a hunger that never sleeps and because hope is the elastic thread of a poor man's life. Shot firing was a science and an art both. In a stubborn seam you drilled the hole, tamped it, set a charge to shoot down coal. Done right, it broke clean and saved backs. Done careless, it lit the air. Men were supposed to snuff their lights while shots went off and keep to a distance. But hurry is a thief in the mines. A shot firer eager to make his rounds sometimes carried a handful of fuses, cut long to save trips, lighting them in a rhythm that turned caution into choreography. A misfire might smoulder in a pocket while the scent of powder, sweet and metallic, blurred the nose's warning. Shots and gas are uneasy neighbours. On certain days they are enemies. Coal dust made its own weather. It coated hair and tongues and the backs of throats. It drifted from roof to floor in a quiet fall that never ceased. When the air was dry and the dust was fine, a man could write his name on a timber and see the letters glow grey. There were ways to tame it, sprinkle with water, pack the roadbed damp, keep the roof moist. Some said to spread stone dust, a practice that would later become law. But in 1907, it lived mostly in words and experiments. In the heady push of December tonnage, water carts ran where they could and skipped where they must, leaving sections where a strike or a spark might teach a lesson no one wanted. Tools told stories too, a nicked steel pick that threw a spark when it met a stray nail. A loose dynamo brush on a trolley locomotive that arced bluish in the dark. A lantern hung too high beneath a roof that trapped gas like a bowl. A mule's harness that dragged a nail across iron, skittering fire like a flint. In an office above ground, a ledger showed only cars and shifts and costs. Underground, every shortcut and every untouched puddle of gas was another line item no one wanted to see. There were rumours of men smoking underground, the ember of a hand-rolled cigarette cupped in a palm between strokes, the habit denied to bosses and admitted only to friends. A match flared bright in a man's memory, even if his mouth never spoke it aloud. The rules were clear, and so were the temptations. A long night, a damp chill, a nervous mind easing itself with tobacco. What begins as warmth travels farther than the man who lit it intended. Timber creaked that autumn more than the last, men said. The pillar robbing in older sections, pulling supports to salvage every last ton, made the roof speak in the languages of strain and patience. When the roof spoke, old miners listened. They cocked their heads for the distant pop like a gunshot that meant pressure was shifting somewhere unseen. A pop means air is moving, rock is moving, and where things move, ventilation changes too. In those shifts, currents flicker and fade. Gas slips from high pockets into lower workplaces where men carry flame. Some Sundays, the sermons carried warnings of another kind, that a man should keep the Sabbath, that holy days deserved holy distance from the pit. Not all heeded, but many did. When December's calendar drew close to a feast on the old country's reckoning, some would stay home, kneel, sing and share bread. Others laced their boots and walked. And in that divide lay one more thread of the disaster's tapestry, how the mine would be crowded or spare, how the ledger would fill, how many lamps would wink in the dark. Inspectors' visits came like storms, sudden, disruptive, and followed by calm. They checked maps, crawled into side headings, asked questions in English that rolled past men who spoke Slovak at home. Violations drew chalk marks and sharp words, and yet inspectors could not stay. A mine is a living thing. It behaves differently in morning and afternoon, in dry weather, and wet, under a falling barometer, and under a rising one. What is safe at dawn can become a trick by noon. The men knew this in their bones, but knowledge does not always have power when a foreman is measuring cars by the hour. The ledger's pressure ran downhill into small decisions. A Brattis man traded a careful seam of canvas for a quick nail driven deep. A door tender, cold and bored, propped his door open with a rock to watch mules pass without rising from his plank. A motorman hurried across a switch with a bit of arcing that faded into the din of picks and shovels. None of these men meant harm. In their minds, they were saving minutes, preserving backs, keeping pace with a winter that wanted more coal than their bodies wanted to give. Old-timers told stories about gas that could run like an animal. It seeks the roof, they'd say. It hunts high places, curls in pockets. In the Darr, certain headings had reputations. New men were warned and nodded, and then they followed the man ahead, trusting the lantern's language more than their own instincts. Instinct is a fine thing, but underground its voice can be hard to separate from fear, and fear is a constant companion. The true language a mind speaks is in the currents you cannot see, and reading it takes years that many men never had. Winter sharpened every danger. The outside air grew heavy and still, the barometer dropped with passing fronts, the pressure in the earth shifted. A breath that kept a flame tame at the beginning of the week might be too weak at the end. The furnace drew harder, the fan strained, and still there were moments when a heading felt close, as if the air itself were tired. In those moments, a smart man would stop and wait for a fresher pull. But smart men had families waiting, and a man cannot fill a coal box with caution alone. There were hints that some entries had been driven faster than the ventilation planned. New places opened before the arteries that fed them grew wide enough. Growth and hunger rarely keep the same pace. A fresh heading promised fresh coal, the air behind it came as it could. In the cramped geometry of timber, track and brattice, a miscalculation may lie invisible until a sky-blue flame leans at a lamp and some man's heart leans with it. Men swore by signs that had no place in any manual. The way a candle's thread of flame narrowed near a roof crack, the taste of metal on the tongue, the cold patch on the cheek that drifted without rhyme. These were folk instruments, crude but hard-earned. They saved lives sometimes. But superstition and skill blur underground. A miner can be brave, expert, and unlucky in the same hour. The week before a disaster, luck becomes a character in the story, always present, never named. The company's paperwork would later list precautions: regulated shot firing, careful inspection, prohibition of open lights in certain headings, instructions to close doors and keep stoppings tight. Good measures on paper, respectable to read. But a mine is not a desk. It is mud and timbers and breath and men with debts. We're doing all right, people said, because most days they were. Most days, a man's lamp lit. His hands found the seam, his shovel filled a car and the fan drew enough to carry him through to dusk. Most days are the lullaby that makes one day feel safe. In the boarding houses, coughs deepened that December, black rattles that seasoned men carried like a second name. Wives warmed stew and laid out shirts near the stove. Children learned to recognize the sound of a boot on steps and the smell of coal ground into wool. News from Monongah had rattled them all, but news cannot compete forever with need. So they rose before the sun, made tea, tied scarves, and sent their men over the bridge. A few had seen more than they wanted. In a side heading, a shot had blown sharp the week before, a quick flame that went out without taking anything with it. One man told his neighbour, "We were lucky, that's all." Another said, "They'll water it better now." The foreman said, "We'll add a brattice," and he did. And in these ordinary responses lived the quiet arithmetic of risk. A small fire answered by a small fix, the ledger's tempo undisturbed. If you asked the mules, they would have told you things too. Animals hear and sense what men harden themselves against. A mule that won't go is a sermon if you let it be, but a man with a stopwatch in his head calls it stubbornness, snaps a line, and the car rolls on. Some men did not come that Thursday morning. They stayed home to keep a feast according to the calendar of their fathers and grandfathers, to sing the old hymns, to take bread and salt and remember saints. Their absence shifted the mine's rhythm, the cadence of picks, the line at the man-trip, the pace in the main entry. A thinner shift does not guarantee safety. Sometimes it only changes which places breathe and which do not. The maps on the mine office wall looked clean. Lines and numbers, crosscuts, headings, pillars and rooms. Underground, those lines blurred into places with smells and sounds that could not be charted. A seam that dipped sharper than expected turned a roof into a basin that caught more than water. A crosscut cut too near a fissure turned a doorway into a funnel that fed air one day and trapped gas the next. In the clean light above ground, such things are lines. Below, they are choices that wait to be made in the dark. No one could point to a single cause and say, "There." Disasters are not made of one thing but of many, of a door and a fuse, of a habit and a hurry, of air that shifted, and a spark that did what sparks do. In the Darr Mine, the warnings were present the way winter is present, constant and easily forgotten, until your breath makes a cloud before your face. And so the valley went on. The whistle marked the hours, the fan turned. Men walked in, heads low against the cold, lamps swinging in small arcs of light. The fire boss made his rounds. The shot firer checked his fuses and powder. The door tender settled onto his plank. Somewhere far inside, a brattice cloth flapped, tugged by a draught that needed strengthening. Somewhere else, a man paused, felt the air with his cheek and kept going. All of it ordinary, all of it a prelude, all of it part of a machine that would, with one unwitnessed touch, turn on itself. By mid-December, the mine carried itself like a strong horse, sweaty, restless, capable. The men had learned its moods and excused its tempers. They believed in their skill because it had saved them over and over. This is a human truth as old as work. Survival breeds confidence, and confidence, untended, grows into blindness. When the fatal morning arrived, nobody walked into the dark to tempt fate. They walked in to do a day's work with the same tools, the same prayers, and the same trust in a routine that had grown familiar enough to seem harmless. The final warning did not look like a warning at all. It was the ordinary commotion of a shift in motion, a cussing mule, a spark that skittered from iron to iron and died, a lamp flame that leaned just a finger's width toward the roof and then straightened, a door that stuck and was wedged open for the next car because, just for a minute, down one heading a fuse burned a little slower than expected. Down another, a pocket of gas, rich and invisible, had drifted where it had no business to be. If the mine could speak, it would have said, "Not now, but mines do not bargain. They gather the conditions we allow and hold them together until something touches." In the Darr, the touch was coming. The air was ready, the dust was at attention. The small decisions of many days sat like kindling laid with care. And somewhere in that network of tunnels wedged between timber and stone, between habit and hurry, the spark that would write its own history waited for a breath of help. The disaster unfolds. Morning settled over the Youghiogheny Valley in a frostbitten hush. Smoke rose thin from chimneys in Smithton, flattening under the heavy air. The men had been underground for hours already, the day's rhythm well underway. Inside the Darr Mine, lanterns bobbed through the entries like a slow constellation. Picks struck coal. Mules snorted in the dark. The low rumble of loaded cars echoed faintly toward the surface, life proceeding as it had for years. At 11:30 a.m., that rhythm was broken forever. It began as a whisper no one heard, a breath of fire damp swirling high along the roof of the fifth right heading, a place men had long known for its sluggish air. A shot firer, setting his last charge, struck a fuse and stepped back. The hiss of the powder string was soft, familiar, reassuring. He waited, counted under his breath. Then the explosion came, but not the one he expected. A white flash filled the tunnel. The flame found the gas in an instant, expanding faster than a blink. A shock of heat raced ahead of the sound. For a heartbeat, the mine lit as bright as day. Then the darkness returned, but changed, violent, roaring, alive. The first blast tore outward, slamming through timbers and doors, scattering the brattice cloth that guided the mine's breath. It reached the main entries and split, racing through both the north and south workings. In its path, every lamp became a fuse, every pocket of dust another charge waiting to ignite. Coal dust rose in a storm, and the air itself became fuel. Miners working miles apart felt it before they heard it. A wind slammed through the tunnels, hot and sudden. Tools clattered from hands. A sound like thunder in a tunnel followed. Deep, rolling, endless. Roofs caved, cars overturned. The mule drivers closest to the mouth never knew what hit them. Those farther in were thrown to the ground, ears ringing, lungs seared by the blast's breath. At the pit mouth, a column of black smoke and flame erupted into the cold air, bursting from the drift opening with a sound like a cannon. It rolled across the hillside, carrying fragments of men's clothes, splintered timbers, and clouds of fine ash. Witnesses on the opposite bank of the river said the flame shot 100 feet high. The shockwave cracked windows in houses across the valley. Trees bowed, chickens scattered, a horse reared and broke its tether. Women who had been hanging laundry froze in place. They knew that sound. In a mining town, no one mistakes the difference between thunder and death. One wife dropped her basket, ran barefoot through snow toward the bridge. Others followed, some screaming their husbands' names into the smoke. Inside the mine, the air turned to poison. After the flame passed, it left behind the black damp, a suffocating gas that moved through the workings like a tide. Men who survived the initial blast struggled for breath, clawing through darkness that would not thin. Those who could still move stumbled toward the airways they could no longer find. Some tied handkerchiefs around their mouths, a futile gesture of instinct. Others knelt in prayer, knowing the air would not last. A few near the outer headings managed to crawl toward light. They emerged burned, dazed, their clothes smouldering, eyes rimmed with soot. Their stories would later piece together the first fragments of what had happened. They said the fire came from below, that it roared like a furnace, that it rolled over them like a wall. They spoke of doors blown from hinges and men thrown against walls as if by the hand of God. Above ground, the mine tipple shook. The fan house shuddered. A foreman ran for the switch to cut power to the trolley lines, afraid of sparks igniting what might still be burning below. Others raced to the main opening, only to be driven back by the heat that poured out. The smoke was thick, sulphurous, heavy with the smell of burning timber and something else, something human. Word spread faster than the wind. Bells rang through Smithton. Men from nearby mines dropped their tools and ran. Within minutes, the road to the Darr was choked with wagons, horses, and crowds. Families gathered at the mouth, faces black with soot and grief. They waited for names that would not come. Down in the hill, the fire burned unseen. Pockets of methane flared in bursts, echoing like cannon shots. Each one sent a tremor through the ground. The mine's network of tunnels, miles long, acted like the lungs of a dying creature, exhaling smoke from multiple openings along the riverbank. At one drift mouth, a man shouted into the dark, only to hear nothing but the sound of air rushing out. The rescue attempts began almost immediately. A few volunteers tied wet cloths over their mouths, grabbed safety lamps, and stepped into the hell the Darr had become. They found wreckage within yards. Splintered props, twisted rails, bodies blackened beyond recognition. The heat drove them back again and again. For every foot they gained, the air took one from them. On the ridge above, the women watched. They stood in clusters, shawls tight around their shoulders, eyes fixed on the black smoke that refused to stop. Some wept quietly. Others stood still as stone, their faces pale, waiting for the moment when the smoke might change colour or stop altogether. Any sign that the fire had burned itself out. By noon, the company office was chaos. Messengers rode to Connellsville and Pittsburgh for rescue crews, for engineers, for doctors. Telegraphs clicked through the region. Explosion at Darr Mine. Hundreds feared dead. The words repeated, multiplied, travelled farther than the smoke itself. Inside, the survivors' lamps flickered and died. Those who had made it to air crossings tried to follow the faint drafts, crawling on hands and knees through debris. Some sang hymns in the dark to keep each other from panicking. Their voices grew weaker with every verse. The gas was winning. By 1 o'clock, the heat at the main entrance had begun to subside enough for men to creep closer. They saw the fan house nearly destroyed, the intake ducts blown out like paper. A rescue team, miners from a neighbouring operation, arrived and began the grim work of shoring up supports and clearing paths. They knew the odds. After such a blast, few would be left alive. Still, they went in. The tunnels were littered with signs of the blast's fury. Iron rails bent like wire. Timber props sheared clean in two. The very rock of the coal face was scorched, its surface glazed by the heat. Tools were fused to the ground. In one heading, a row of cars lay overturned, their loads of coal still smouldering. Near them, the outlines of men lay where they had fallen, their shapes etched in soot against the wall. Everywhere the silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of settling rock and the hiss of unseen fires. The rescuers advanced slowly, marking their path with chalk, listening for any sound of life. In the distance, a beam cracked and fell. Dust rose again, thick and choking. They retreated, coughing, their lungs raw. "Too hot," one said. "It's breathing fire still." Outside, snow began to fall, thin flakes melting as they touched the blackened ground. The contrast was cruel, a white skid over a valley of smoke. Reporters began to arrive by afternoon, their notepads damp, their eyes wide at the sight. They asked questions no one could answer. How many men? How deep? Any survivors? The foreman could only shake his head. By evening, the first bodies were carried out. They came wrapped in canvas, laid in rows near the riverbank. Families pressed forward, desperate for names, but most could not recognize the faces. The heat had taken more than life, it had taken identity itself. Priests from St. Nicholas came with lanterns and prayers, murmuring the rites of the dead in Slovak, the words rising and falling with the hiss of the wind. As night fell, the fire still raged below. Flames licked the mouth of the mine, dim but stubborn. A team tried to seal the openings to smother the oxygen, but each attempt was met with a new burst of heat. The earth seemed determined to keep breathing. In Smithton, every window glowed with lamplight that night. Mothers kept vigil. Children slept fitfully, dreaming of the roar they'd heard. The men who had survived sat wordless at their tables, black streaks on their faces as where tears had cut through soot. They knew what the smoke meant. In a mine, no man survives that kind of fire. At the company office, clerks began compiling lists, names of those known to be inside, those accounted for, those who might have switched shifts. The number grew larger than anyone dared to speak aloud. 200, then 230, then more. Some said 250. The exact figure would shift for days, like the smoke itself. Down below, the fire moved slowly through the chambers, consuming what little remained. Timber supports turned to charcoal, roofs sagged. The rescuers withdrew for the night, exhausted, coughing, their faces streaked with ash. Behind them, the mine exhaled one last plume of smoke wide and dark before the air turned still. The Darr Mine had become a tomb. At dawn the next morning, frost clung to everything, the trees, the rails, the ropes, by the mouth of the pit. Men gathered again, silent, shivering, waiting for orders. The fan had now stopped turning. The valley smelled of sulphur and sorrow. The rescue effort would continue, but everyone knew what they would find inside. Only questions remained. Who was to blame, how it had begun, and whether any man still breathed below that hill. The answers waited in the dark. The morning after the explosion broke cold and grey. The sun tried to pierce the haze that hung over Smithton, but could not. Smoke from the Darr still curled in slow ribbons from the hill's side, mingling with the fog off the Youghiogheny River. A thin crust of frost glistened on the wreckage around the fan house, and the silence was heavy enough to make men whisper when they spoke. By dawn, hundreds had gathered, wives clutching shawls, children huddled beside them, miners from nearby operations standing grimly with lanterns and picks. The valley had become a vigil. Horses steamed in the cold as wagons from Connellsville and Fayette City arrived with rescue crews, doctors and priests. Men of the U.S. Bureau of Mines came as well, their faces drawn and sober. Everyone knew the odds. No one expected miracles. Still, the miners insisted on going in. They waited until the air at the driftmouth cooled enough to breathe. The fan had been restarted with a makeshift patch, forcing a faint current through the tunnels. The first rescue teams entered around mid-morning, 4 men at a time, roped together, carrying safety lamps and stretchers. Behind them, others stood ready with the canvas shrouds. The smell that met them was indescribable. Burned timber, sulphur, and something acrid and final. Each step deeper felt like entering the lungs of the earth itself, still smouldering. Inside, the mine was transformed beyond recognition. Where there had once been clean-cut headings and numbered crossways, there was now ruin. Roofs had caved, props splintered, rails twisted. The walls were blackened, the coal itself glazed by the heat. Smoke hung thick even after the night's ventilation. It coated every surface, clung to the tongue, stung the eyes. Their lamps glowed dim through the haze, small islands of light swallowed by darkness. They advanced slowly. At the first turn they found the bodies of 2 men, door tenders, perhaps, crumpled near their posts, faces blackened, limbs drawn tight by heat. The doors themselves were gone, blown apart. A few yards farther, a mule lay on its side, the harness burned away. The rescuers marked the location in chalk and pressed on. The silence underground was absolute. Not the living kind of quiet, but the absence of everything. No dripping, no creaking, no sound of air. Only the scrape of boots and the faint rattle of gear. In one entry they found the remains of a brattice cloth fluttering weakly, still burning at the edges. Beyond it, a pocket of gas forced them back. The air hissed faintly as if exhaling through a wound. They returned to the surface for fresh air and reported what they'd seen. The faces that met them outside were desperate for news, but the rescuers could offer none. "No survivors," one said, voice breaking. "Not a one yet." By noon the second crew entered. This time they carried extra timber to shore the roof and long poles to test the air. They crept past the same landmarks, the collapsed cars, the blackened mule, and reached farther in. The ground was littered with scattered tools, picks, shovels, lunch pails, boots blown from feet. Everything looked frozen mid-movement, as though time itself had stopped the instant the flame struck. In one chamber they found a cluster of men who had clearly tried to flee. Their bodies lay in a line leading toward the main airway, one hand still clutching a rosary, another a lunch tin. None had made it more than a few yards. Some were untouched by fire, lying as if asleep. Others were burned beyond recognition. The rescuers turned them gently, checking pockets for identification tags, shaking their heads when they found none. Many of the miners had been immigrants, names long, unfamiliar, sometimes never written on paper. To identify them would take days. The priests above ground began keeping lists, families pressed forward with names, descriptions, pleas. "He wears a silver cross," one woman said. "He has a scar on his cheek," said another. The priest listened, nodded, made marks. The numbers grew, each name a prayer unanswered. That afternoon a new danger arose. The fire deep within the Fifth Right heading flared again, fed by a sudden draft when a door was opened too soon. A second explosion rattled the mine, smaller than the first but strong enough to drive men back from the mouth. For a moment everyone thought the entire hill would go again. Women screamed. Rescuers stumbled from the entry coughing, eyes wide with fear. The smoke turned darker, tinged red from reflected flame. They shut down the fan and waited, listening to the earth growl and then fall still again. By evening the decision was made to seal parts of the mine. Engineers from Pittsburgh declared the air too dangerous to support continued entry. They began building bulkheads of brick and clay at the main drifts, hoping to starve the fire of oxygen. It was grim work. Each blow of a hammer echoed like a tolling bell, a wall being built between the living and the dead. The families begged them not to stop, but even the strongest men could not fight both flame and gas. For 2 days the mine stayed sealed. Smoke seeped through cracks, curling up into the winter air like incense from 1,000 unseen candles. The valley smelled of burnt earth and grief. Trains brought coffins by the carload, plain wooden boxes stacked near the riverbank, waiting for bodies that had yet to be found. Reporters wrote that the Darr was a furnace beneath the hills, and that all hope was gone. On the third day after the fires had finally subsided, crews broke through the seals. The air that rushed out was foul, thick with carbon monoxide and dust. They waited again, then went back in, this time with wet cloths over their faces, crawling on their hands and knees to stay below the heaviest gas. Their lamps showed the same scenes repeated again and again. Men where they had fallen, hands raised in defense or prayer, are grouped together as if they tried to help each other in the final seconds. There was no sign of panic, only the stillness of sudden death. At one crosscut near the old workings, they found something remarkable. A group of miners, 7 in all, had survived the first blast long enough to build a barricade of boards and sacks. They had sealed themselves in, hoping to outlast the gas. On the wall behind them was a faint message scratched with a pick. "Pray for us." They had suffocated before rescue could reach them. The words, when later reported, would become the symbol of the entire tragedy. The work of recovery stretched for weeks. Each day brought new discoveries, each one a blow. By Christmas Eve, nearly all the reachable bodies had been found, 239 men in total, though some accounts placed the number higher. The count included boys as young as 16 and men well into their 50s. The miners' ethnic societies and church groups took turns identifying and burying their own. Coffins lined the road to Smithton, carried by horse-drawn wagons draped in black. Bells tolled from St. Nicholas without pause. Those who survived by chance carried their own burden. A few men had stayed home that day to observe the feast of St. Nicholas on the Julian calendar, their families following the old country's tradition. They were alive because of faith, not foresight, and the weight of that grace haunted them. They walked through town with bowed heads, avoiding the eyes of widows who wondered why their husbands had not been among the lucky few. The company offices filled with reporters, investigators, and officials from the state. Questions piled high, but answers were scarce. The mine maps were incomplete, ventilation records inconsistent, and testimony fragmented. Some blamed open lamps, others pointed to a misfired shot or a door left open. The superintendent insisted the workings were in good condition. The surviving miners said otherwise. But the truth, buried beneath hundreds of feet of collapsed tunnels, could not be reached. The mine's entrances became makeshift chapels. Families laid flowers and candles at the drift mouth, their flickering light casting halos on the soot-stained rock. Women knelt in the snow whispering prayers for souls they could no longer hope to recover. Children watched silently, clutching their mothers' skirts, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the weight of absence. Day by day, the rescuers carried out the last of the bodies. The ground around the mine turned to mud, trampled by boots and wheels. The priests' voices grew hoarse from prayer. At night, the town glowed dimly under gaslight, but the streets were empty. The sound of shovels striking earth in the cemetery echoed across the valley long after midnight. Then in early January, the last group of searchers emerged carrying the final remains. They set the stretcher down beside the others, covered it gently, and stood in silence. One of them crossed himself, another removed his cap. "That's all of them," the foreman said quietly. "God rest their souls." When the work was done, the mine was sealed again, this time for good. Stone and timber closed the entrances. The fan stopped. The valley went quiet. In Pittsburgh, newspapers called the Darr explosion the worst mining disaster in Pennsylvania history. In the same month, Monongah, Naomi, Yolande, other names, other graves, filled the front pages. It was the deadliest year the coalfields had ever seen. Across the country, men began to speak the word safety in a new way, though for the families along the Youghiogheny, such words came too late. Back in Smithton, the funerals went on for days. The churchyards filled beyond capacity, forcing new graves to be dug on the hill. Snow fell through the ceremonies, silent and relentless. The priests read the same rites again and again until their voices failed. Each coffin lowered was another piece of the town itself disappearing underground. When the last service ended, the bells fell silent. The women went home to houses where boots still stood by doors and lunch pails sat on shelves. The sound of the mine fan, once the heartbeat of the valley, was gone. In its absence, the town felt hollow. Children learned to walk past the riverbank without looking toward the hill. For weeks after, the smoke still seeped faintly from cracks in the earth, thin wisps rising like ghosts. Some said they could smell the fire in the air long into spring. Others claimed they heard sounds in the night, a distant echo like picks striking rock or voices carried on the wind. The mine was sealed, but its presence lingered, heavy and unseen. The investigation would eventually conclude that gas had ignited from a lamp or shot, that coal dust had magnified the blast, that poor ventilation and human haste had done the rest. But no report could capture the truth the town already knew. That danger had been living with them all along, quiet, invisible, waiting for its moment. For generations, miners would tell the story of the Darr, the day the river valley shook, the day smoke turned the snow black. Fathers warned sons about air that could kill without colour or smell. Wives learned to listen for silence more than for sound. And every December, the bells of St. Nicholas tolled again, one for each man lost, their echo travelling across the Youghiogheny as the valley bowed its head. The disaster had ended in hours, but its unfolding, its aftermath, its reckoning had only begun. The earth had taken its toll, and the town would spend years learning how to breathe again. The rescue and aftermath. By the time the last embers of the Darr mine cooled, Smithton had become a town of widows and silence. The Youghiogheny River carried away the ashen soot, but not the grief that settled on its banks. For weeks the valley had lived in the rhythm of funerals, bells tolling in slow succession, black-clad processions winding up the hill, the ground soft and open with loss. It was said you could walk from one end of the cemetery to the other without stepping between the graves of men who died that day. When the rescuers finally laid down their tools, their faces were hollow, their hands raw from weeks of scraping through soot and ruin. They had seen too much. Some swore off the mines entirely, unable to return to the dark. Others went back within days because they had to. The mines did not wait for morning. Inside company offices, typewriters clattered. Names were typed and numbered, statements gathered, inquiries announced. The figures rose from rumour to record. 239 men confirmed dead. Some said it was more, but the ledgers would stop there. Most were Slovak, Hungarian, Italian, immigrants whose names Americans struggled to pronounce, whose families spoke grief in languages the newspapers could not translate. The Pittsburgh press called it a tragedy of foreigners, as if that lessened the weight. But in Smithton the loss had no accent. The bodies that could be identified were buried with rites from their homelands. The others, burned beyond knowing, were placed in shared coffins and marked with crosses bearing no names. The snow fell thick through December. muffling everything. At night, the light of candles flickered in cottage windows, each one burning for someone who would not return. At St. Nicholas Church, the pews overflowed for the memorial mass. The air smelled of beeswax and coal smoke. Women clutched rosaries until their fingers turned white. Priests read lists of the dead, voice trembling as the names echoed through the stone nave, each one followed by the same refrain, "Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord." The words fell like the sound of dirt on wood. Children cried, men stood motionless, hats in hand, eyes fixed on the floor. When the final bell rang, no one moved for a long time. In the days that followed, reporters filled the town, men with notepads and overcoats searching for stories among the ruins. They interviewed survivors, priests, widows, anyone who would speak. They wrote of courage and tragedy, of men who'd gone in to save others and never come back. But no newspaper could capture what it meant to live in a valley that had lost nearly every able-bodied man in a single breath. The stories could describe the fire, the smoke, the official numbers, but not the sound of a mother calling into an empty room, not the way the mine whistle's silence made the mornings unbearable. The company's response was swift but hollow. Officials promised compensation, $100 for each man killed. The checks came with clauses. Final settlements, no further claims. To families that had lost their breadwinner, even that felt like charity soaked in insult. Some refused to sign, others had no choice. Food was running out and winter was not done with them. Charity committees formed in Pittsburgh and Connellsville. Money came in from churches, labor unions, and strangers moved by the headlines. Boxes of clothing and food arrived by rail. Volunteers distributed them door to door, though no gesture could fill the empty chairs by the hearth. The miners' wives took in laundry, some found work in kitchens or boarding houses. Others gathered each night to pray, their candles flickering in rows on windowsills that faced the dark outline of the mine. The glow looked like a constellation born of grief. Within weeks, investigators from the state began their inquiry. They descended into what remained of the Darr's lower levels once the air was clear enough to enter. The tunnels were still blackened, the timbers brittle, the air heavy. They walked with notebooks and safety lamps, sketching damage, measuring the distances where the blast had turned coal into glass. The conclusion, when it came, was simple and damning. Methane gas, ignited by an open flame likely at a miner's lamp, or the spark from a shot. They called it the inevitable result of unsafe conditions. The phrase appeared in the report like punctuation on a eulogy written too late. But everyone in Smithton already knew. The miners had spoken of gas, of poor ventilation, of warnings unheeded. The fire bosses had marked their doors and filed their reports. The company had weighed the risk and kept digging. Profit and pressure had done what they always did, turned time into danger. At the same moment, across the country, the nation was beginning to realize that something had to change. The Darr explosion had come less than 2 weeks after the Monongah disaster in West Virginia, where more than 360 men had perished. Together they painted a portrait of an industry bleeding its workers dry. In Washington, lawmakers who had long ignored the coalfields now read the numbers aloud on the House floor. The press called it the December of Death. It was the sound of a country finally listening, though too late for the men of Smithton. Back in the valley, life reassembled itself slowly, unevenly. The schools reopened, the rail line resumed its runs, the company's offices, cleaned and repaired, began advertising for new workers before the year was out. There was always more coal to be mined. A few men, those who had survived by staying home on the holy day, went back first. They said the mine felt like a grave that still breathed. Every creak, every drop of water, every whisper of air sounded like the memory of the explosion. But the bills came, and the coal beneath the hills waited. The women of St. Nicholas formed a society for the widows and orphans, pooling what little money they had. They tended to each other, cooked for funerals, and raised the children left behind. Some of those children would grow up to leave the valley altogether, carrying with them the memory of fathers they barely remembered. Others would stay and take up the same trade because coal was both curse and inheritance. When the weather warmed, the site of the explosion turned green again. Grass grew where smoke had risen. The drift openings were sealed with stone marked by simple wooden crosses. In time, the mine tipple was dismantled, its iron hauled away for scrap. The hillside fell quiet, reclaimed by vines and birds. Only the river remembered, carrying bits of black dust in its current long after the town had moved on. In Pittsburgh, labor organizers began citing Darr and Monongah as proof of the industry's indifference. 2,000 men dead in a single year, one pamphlet read, and not a single law to protect the living. Their agitation would, in time, lead to change. The establishment of the US Bureau of Mines in 1910, the first federal effort to study and prevent such disasters. But for the families of Smithton, those reforms came as faint comfort. Their world had already ended. Every December thereafter, St. Nicholas Church held a requiem mass. Survivors and families filled the pews, candles trembling in their hands. They sang in Slovak and Hungarian, the hymns of their homeland. Outside, the cold air carried their voices down the valley. The younger children would look up, confused, asking why everyone cried during the songs. The elders would answer softly, "We remember the fire." For decades, the site of the Darr Mine remained untouched. Nature crept over it like mercy. But even years later, on still winter mornings, smoke from distant chimneys would drift over the river in a shape that reminded some of that terrible day, a single dark plume rising from the hill. Old miners would stop and watch, their breath frosting in the air, and fall silent. There were stories that lingered too, strange tales told by those who swore they'd seen lights in the woods, or heard the faint sound of picks striking stone where no man worked. Others said that after a heavy rain you could smell coal gas near the old drift mouth, as if the mine still breathed below. The rational men dismissed it as the imagination. The older ones crossed themselves quietly and walked on. For the widows the years stretched long. Some remarried, others never did. Their faces appeared in church pews year after year until their children took their place. Each generation learned the story as part of the town's inheritance. The day the hill caught fire, the day the valley went silent, the day faith saved some and fate spared none. The mine company eventually sold its holdings, its name changing hands through mergers and bankruptcies. New mines opened farther down the river, promising safer conditions, better equipment, improved ventilation. Yet every man who walked into a new shaft still carried the ghost of Darr with him. He knew that every light he struck, every match he lit could awaken what sleeps in stone. By the 1930s, when the coal boom faded and the Depression spread across Pennsylvania, few of the original survivors remained. But each December the bells still tolled at St. Nicholas. The sound travelled farther now, past the river, over the ridges, into towns that had forgotten the name Darr, but still bore its legacy. The miners' children had become steelworkers, machinists, farmers, but the memory of that day lay buried in them like a seam of coal waiting to surface in story and sorrow. For all its tragedy, the Darr disaster did more than end lives. It exposed the brutal arithmetic of industrial progress. The reports that followed, the hearings and reforms, all bore its shadow. Safety lamps replaced open flames. Ventilation systems were improved. Dust control became a mandate, not a suggestion. The Bureau of Mines began studying explosions scientifically, tracing the chain of cause and effect that had so long been ignored. Slowly, the industry began to reckon with its own creation. Yet for those who lived through it, progress was a pale companion to memory. The Darr was not numbers or policy. It was the sound of an explosion that tore a hill apart, the sight of smoke rising where fathers worked, the weight of a silence that lasted generations. Every miner who descended into the dark afterward carried that knowledge. The earth can take everything without warning. Even now, more than a century later, the landscape bears quiet testimony. Beneath the forested slopes near Van Meter, the sealed entries remain, hidden among roots and leaves. A few crumbling foundations still mark where the tipple once stood. The river moves on, whispering against its banks. Fishermen cast their lines nearby, unaware that beneath their feet lies the resting place of nearly 240 men. In 2007, a century after the disaster, descendants gathered there for a memorial. They lit candles and sang the old hymns once more. Some had travelled from Europe, tracing family names back through ship manifests and census lists. The wind off the river was cold, just as it had been that morning, in 1907. When the priest raised his hand in blessing, the crowd fell silent. For a moment it felt as though time itself paused. The same valley, the same sky, the same echo of grief carried forward like an unbroken chain. And when the final prayer ended, Deum, one of the descendants, a young man who'd never set foot in a mine, stepped forward and placed a piece of coal at the memorial's base. For them, he said softly. The gesture was small, but it meant what words could not. The Darr Mine was gone, but its story had become part of something larger, the long, unending struggle between man and the earth he labours within. The valley no longer trembles with the sound of explosions, but its soil holds memory like it holds coal, deep, dark and enduring. The Youghiogheny flows past, indifferent and eternal, reflecting the hills that once burned. And on cold mornings, when mist gathers low, some say you can still smell the faint scent of smoke, lingering like a ghost that refuses to leave. The legacy. The story of the Darr Mine did not end with the sealing of its tunnels. In many ways, that was only where it began, in the slow and painful reckoning that followed. The disaster had not merely taken lives. It had forced America to look directly at what its progress cost, to see the human faces behind the coal that powered its factories, its trains, its very heartbeat. For years before Darr, mine explosions had been treated as the price of doing business. A brief paragraph in the newspaper, a promise of inquiry, then silence. But December of 1907, the month that claimed Monongah, Naomi, Yolanda, and finally Darr, was too catastrophic to ignore. More than 700 miners perished across the country in those 4 weeks. Editors called it the deadliest month in American industry. Ministers called it divine punishment. Labour leaders called it something else entirely, the consequence of greed and neglect. In Pittsburgh, telegrams arrived daily bearing updates from Smithton. The headlines grew bolder, the tone more furious. "Mine after mine blows men to bits," read one. "When will Pennsylvania learn?" asked another. The public began to understand what the miners had always known, that the same forces which drove the economy forward also drove men underground and often left them there. Investigators came from Harrisburg, from Washington, from the Bureau of Mines newly forming in response to public outrage. Their reports were clinical, precise, and quietly damning. The Darr explosion, they wrote, had been caused by fire damp methane gas, ignited by an open flame, likely from a miner's lamp or a misfired shot. Poor ventilation and heavy coal dust had turned the mine into a powder keg. The systems designed to prevent such an event were inadequate or inconsistently maintained. That phrase, inadequately maintained, became a euphemism for indifference. But the true legacy of Darr was not written in reports. It was written in the way America began to change its relationship with Russie, with work, and with the men who bore the nation's weight in darkness. The Darr explosion helped transform safety from a suggestion into a science. Before 1907, mining safety was left largely to companies themselves. Each mine was its own kingdom, ruled by production quotas and local custom. The few state inspectors that existed were overworked and underpaid, responsible for hundreds of sites scattered across mountains and valleys. Their visits were brief, their authority limited. When accidents occurred, companies blamed workers blamed fate. But after Darr, public anger reached a boiling point. In the first weeks of 1908, Pennsylvania legislators introduced a wave of new some safety bills. They called for stricter inspections, mandatory training for fire bosses, and the prohibition of open lamps in gassy mines. Coal operators resisted, of course, arguing that too much regulation would cripple the industry, but even they could not deny the numbers. In that single year, more than 3,000 miners had died nationwide. Fathers, sons, and brothers reduced to figures in ledgers and graves in frozen ground. The outrage had become too large to contain. The creation of the US Bureau of Mines in 1910 was the most enduring outcome of that fury. Its mission was simple but revolutionary: to study the causes of mine explosions scientifically, to develop methods for prevention, and to protect the lives of miners through research rather than luck. It was the first time the federal government acknowledged that the cost of industry could not be measured in profit alone. And though it would take years for those changes to reach every hollow and valley, the foundation was laid in the ashes of the Darr Mine. Engineers began to experiment with safer lighting, enclosed lamps, electric torches, and devices that could test air for gas before men entered. The Bureau's experimental mines in Pittsburgh and Brewston became laboratories for safety, where scientists recreated explosions under controlled conditions to understand how gas and dust behaved. Out of those experiments came new technologies: water sprays to keep dust down, rock dusting with limestone to neutralize explosions, and fans that could circulate air deep into the workings. Each innovation bore the fingerprints of tragedy, Monongah, Naomi, Darr, written into the margins of progress. Yet for all the scientific gains, change at the human level came slower. The widows of Smithton still lived in poverty. Their children still went hungry. Relief funds dried up within a year and charity faded with the headlines. Some families left Pennsylvania entirely, joining the migration west to newer coalfields in Illinois and Ohio. Others stayed, building new lives from the ruins of old ones. But in every mining town from West Virginia to Colorado, the name Darr became a warning told to new hires before their first descent. Respect the air, respect the gas, it waits for carelessness. In the decades that followed, the Darr mine itself disappeared from the maps. Nature reclaimed the site, grass growing over the drift mouths, trees swallowing the rail beds. Only the small cemetery on the hill remained, its headstones carved with unfamiliar names and foreign prayers. The locals tended it quietly. Each December, a few surviving families gathered there with flowers and candles. They did not speak much. The act of coming was enough. As time passed, memory became history. The children of the dead became old men themselves, their recollections fading like the soot stains on the rocks. Some recalled the day the sky turned black. Others remembered the sound of the explosion echoing off the river valley. A few spoke of dreams they'd had afterward, of voices calling from the hills, of the smell of smoke that lingered for years. The Darr disaster became part of local folklore, woven into the landscape like a scar the earth refused to hide. By mid-century, when coal production peaked again during the wars, the lessons of Darr were cited in textbooks and training manuals. The Bureau of Mines taught its recruits about the December disasters, case studies in human error, and the evolution of safety engineering. The language was dry, academic, almost detached. But beneath the diagrams and flowcharts, the human story still breathed. Each figure, each technical finding had been bought with human lives. The 1950s brought mechanization, electric drills, conveyor belts, and stronger ventilation fans. Mines grew deeper and more complex, but also were in many ways safer. Dust explosions became rarer, gas detection improved, the number of fatalities dropped, and yet, even as technology advanced, the moral equation remained the same. Profit versus precaution, speed versus safety. Every new generation of miners learned the same truth their grandfathers had known, that the earth has patience but not forgiveness. In Smithton, the Darr site was almost forgotten by then. The old church burned and was rebuilt. The cemetery fence rusted. Only a few local historians kept the story alive. In 1957, on the 50th anniversary, a group of townspeople held a small service. They erected a simple stone monument near the old drift entrance, inscribed in both English and Slovak. In memory of the 239 men who perished here, may their sacrifice never be forgotten. Few outside the valley attended, but for those who did, the air felt heavy, as if the ground beneath them still remembered the roar that had once split it open. Through the latter half of the 20th century, America's appetite for coal waxed and waned. New energy sources rose and many old mines closed. But each time another explosion occurred, in Kentucky and West Virginia and Utah, the headlines echoed the same refrain. Safety measures ignored, company failed to act, and families left to grieve. The ghosts of Darr walked those tunnels too, reminding everyone that the lessons of the past are easily learned and easily forgotten. In the 1980s, the US Bureau of Mines published a centennial report on the progress of mine safety. It cited the Darr disaster as one of the pivotal events that had shaped the agency's mission. Fatalities, once in the thousands, had dropped by more than 90%. Methane detection systems, automatic shutoffs, and modern rescue teams had turned mining from a gamble into a profession. The report concluded optimistically. The miner of today stands safer than at any point in our history. Yet even that statement carried a shadow because history has a way of humbling certainty. The descendants of the Darr miners carried on in quieter ways. Some left mining entirely, their children becoming teachers, engineers, and clerks. Others stayed in the valleys of Pennsylvania, their lives still measured by the shift whistle and the smell of coal smoke in winter. For many, pride in their ancestors mingled with sorrow. They spoke of men who had come to America seeking opportunity and found only the grave, but they also spoke of resilience, of how their families had endured, built churches, raised children, and kept faith alive in a land that had nearly taken everything from them. In 2007, 100 years after the explosion, the town gathered again. The hill overlooking the river was quiet that morning, blanketed in snow. A new monument had been built, a polished granite stone etched with all the 239 names, finally recorded in full. The descendants came from across the country, some from as far away as Slovakia and Hungary. They carried old photographs, letters, and rosaries that had belonged to the men who died. When the ceremony began, the bells of St. Nicholas tolled once more, their sound carrying over the water just as it had in 1907. A priest spoke of faith and endurance. A historian read from the eyewitness accounts. Then, as the crowd stood in silence, a coal miner from a nearby operation stepped forward. He wore a hard hat and carried a small lamp. Without a word, he placed it at the foot of the monument and turned it on. The soft yellow glow illuminated the names carved into the stone, reflecting in the snow like a flame reborn. It was a symbol not of destruction, but of remembrance, the light that endures after darkness. The Darr Mine Disaster remains one of the worst in American history, yet it is also one of the least remembered. Its victims were immigrants, their voices lost in translation, their stories scattered across archives and family law. But every safety law, every regulation, every flame-proof lamp owes something to them. Their deaths were not in vain, even if their names faded from the nation's lips. Today the site lies beneath forest and moss. The air is clean again, the river runs clear, and the hum of machinery has long since ceased. But if you walk there in winter, when the leaves are gone and the wind cuts low through the valley, you can still see the outline of what once was, the faint depression where the drift mouth collapsed, the old rail bed leading nowhere, the rusted hinge of a door that once held back the breath of the earth. History does not heal, it teaches, if we listen. The Darr Mine taught a country what happens when progress outruns compassion, when the demand for more becomes a demand for everything. It taught that safety is not charity but responsibility, that the true cost of power is measured not in tons of coal but in lives remembered and laws written in their honour. And though more than a century has passed, the echo of that December morning still lingers beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, in the whisper of wind through bare trees, in the hum of modern machinery that runs safer now because of them, and in the quiet promise that their story, once born in darkness, will never again be buried there. The reflection of losses. Today, the Darr Mine exists only in memory, a hollow beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, sealed by stone and time. The earth has long since healed over its wounds. Grass grows thick where smoke once rose. The Youghiogheny River flows quietly past, washing away the last trace of ash. Yet even now, when the wind is still and the air carries the faint scent of cold iron and pine, those who know the story say they can feel it, a heaviness beneath the soil, like the earth remembering what it was made to hold. Every December, descendants gather at the monument. Some come from nearby towns, others travel across oceans. They bring wreaths, candles, and the old hymns their ancestors sang in the language of their homeland. The ceremony is small, unpublicized, but it feels larger than it looks. When the bells of St. Nicholas toll 239 times, the sound rolls through the valley like a heartbeat returned to the land. It is the sound of memory refusing to die. To walk the ground today is to walk on history, not the kind written in books, but the kind that lives in silence. The faint outline of the railbed still cuts through the woods. If you follow it, it leads you to a low rise where the mine once opened its mouth to swallow men whole. There is nothing left now but moss-covered stones, a few rusted bolts, and the weight of the air. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the sound of shovels, the creak of timber, the distant hum of the fan that once kept men alive, the sound of work, of courage, of risk accepted without choice. In its quiet way, the Darr Mine Disaster changed more than just mining laws. It changed how America understood labour itself. It reminded the nation that progress was not an abstract thing built from machines and money, but from human lives. That every ton of coal that lit a city came from the sweat of men who worked in the dark so that others could live in the light. That safety, dignity, and justice were not luxuries, but debts owed to those who had paid the ultimate price. The lesson was learned, forgotten, and learned again, as all such lessons are. New mines would open, new tragedies would follow. Each time reporters would write of the worst disaster since Darr. Each time families would gather around photographs of men who never came home. And each time the same truth would echo: the earth is patient, but it never forgives carelessness. For the people of Smithton, life eventually resumed. Children grew, churches rebuilt, laughter returned to the valley. But the old ones never forgot. They would sit on porches at dusk, staring toward the hills, their stories slow and steady. "That's where your grandfather worked," they'd say. "That's where the hill caught fire." They spoke softly, as though the mine were still listening. And maybe it is. Beneath the layers of soil and root, the tunnels remain, collapsed, silent, filled with the dust of time. The men who died there are part of the bedrock now, their names carved not only into stone but into the moral foundation of an industry that learned painfully what its labour truly cost. The Darr disaster reminds us that history is not just what happened, but what continues to happen when we stop paying attention. It is the echo of a decision made too quickly, the consequence of a warning ignored, the result of believing that tomorrow will always come. It is the human story, our brilliance and our blindness intertwined. Standing on that hillside today, it's easy to imagine the valley as it was that morning in 1907, the river frozen at its edges, smoke rising from chimneys, men crossing the bridge with lunch pails in hand. You can almost see their silhouettes against the pale winter sky, proud, tired, unaware of what waits below. And for a moment you wish you could call out to them, tell them to turn back, to take one more day, to wait for safer air. But history cannot be undone. It can only be remembered. So we remember. We remember the 239 men who entered the Darr Mine that cold December morning and never returned. We remember their families, who carried on without them. We remember the lessons their sacrifice carved into the conscience of a nation. Because if we forget, the darkness they faced will rise again, in new forms, under new names, in new industries that once more choose profit over people. The story of Darr is not just a story of coal, it is a story of humanity, of what we owe each other when we build, when we dig, when we dare to reach for progress at any cost. When the bells finish tolling, the valley grows quiet again. The river moves, the wind shifts, the candles flicker out, but the memory remains, steady, enduring, alive beneath the soil. And somewhere deep in the earth, the last ember of the Darr Mine still glows faintly, not as a fire of destruction, but as a light of remembrance. Because even after the smoke fades and the machinery stops, one truth endures. When the flame went out in the Darr Mine, it lit something greater in the hearts of those left behind. And though the mine fell silent, its story never will.